You need a home. My daughter needs someone to call Mom, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago said to the shivering woman on the frozen bench. A few hours earlier, Ivy Collins wasn't here. She was on her feet in Frank Castellano's restaurant kitchen, scrubbing grease off industrial stoves, while her head spun and fever sweat soaked through her thin uniform despite the freezing draft from the back door. She had told him she was sick, first in a whisper, then louder when her knees buckled against the steel counter. I have a fever, sir. I just need a short break. He didn't bother looking up from his ledger. You people always have excuses. She kept working. Every movement hammered through her skull like a nail being driven deeper. When she slowed down, he noticed. When she asked if she could finish the remaining dishes in the morning, he laughed coldly. Finish tonight or don't get paid. By the time she wiped down the last counter, her vision had blurred into watercolors. She reached for the envelope with her wages. He snatched it back. I'm docking your entire pay for poor performance, she begged. Quietly at first, then with tears she despised herself for shedding. She explained about the fever, the missed bus, the snowstorm rolling in. He called her lazy, ungrateful, said she should be thankful to have work at all. Before she could step toward the door, he grabbed a glass bottle from the counter and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall inches from her head. Get out. Don't ever come back. Now, hours later, Ivy sat hunched beneath the flickering shelter light on the corner of Michigan Avenue. Her body trembled in waves she could no longer control. Fever heat burned behind her eyes, clashing cruelly with the cold gnawing at her bones. Her gray work uniform showed beneath a thin, threadbare coat. Her bare hands, swollen and red, were shoved deep into her sleeves. Wind swept down the avenue, scattering snow across her lap. She looked up once more, searching for headlights, searching for anything. Nothing answered. Then, tires crunching on ice. A black SUV eased down the block, its headlights carving tunnels through the snowfall. It slowed. It stopped. In the back seat, a little girl pressed her mittened hands to the window, breath fogging the glass. Her brown eyes were wide, thoughtful, far too old for her small face. Daddy, she whispered. She looks cold, like Mommy did in my dreams. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Marcus Blackwood sat motionless in the back seat, his chest tightening as if an invisible hand had closed around it when he heard his daughter whisper, "Just like Mom in my dreams." Those 6 words cut straight through the expensive overcoat, through the tailored suit, through every wall he'd built over the last 2 years, and drove into the heart he'd thought had gone numb. Dante, the man in the driver's seat, glanced into the rearview mirror with cautious eyes. "Boss?" he asked softly, his tone respectful, as if he were speaking to a king. And in a way, he was. Marcus Blackwood wasn't an ordinary businessman. Beneath the seat, a pistol lay in a black leather case, ready for any situation. His gaze was cold and sharp, accustomed to darkness, accustomed to life or death choices ordinary people never had to face. In Chicago, the name Blackwood didn't conjure office towers or polished boardrooms. It conjured fear, respect, and sometimes death. But right now, the city's most notorious mafia boss was only a father looking at his daughter. Lily hadn't spoken to strangers since Celeste was gone. 2 years. 730 days of silence, of shrinking inward, of refusing every attempt at contact. The most expensive nannies couldn't do it. The best child psychologists couldn't do it. And now, a homeless woman trembling on an ice-cold stone bench had made the little girl open her mouth. "Stop the car," Marcus ordered. Dante didn't ask why. He'd worked for Marcus long enough to know his boss never did anything without reason, but this was the first time in all those years Marcus Blackwood had ordered the car to stop because of a stranger. The black SUV eased to the curb. Marcus reached back and took the dark blue cashmere scarf that had been folded neatly there for a very long time. The scarf Celeste used to wear every winter. The scarf he couldn't bring himself to throw away, but hadn't dared to look at, either. He opened the door and stepped out into the snowstorm. The wind cut at his face like thousands of tiny blades. But Marcus didn't flinch. He was used to pain. This kind of physical pain was nothing compared to what he'd endured. He walked toward the woman on the bench. She looked up at the sound of footsteps, and Marcus saw green eyes shot through with red from fever, from exhaustion, from something deeper he recognized at once. Desperation. But there was wariness, too. She watched him like a cornered animal, ready to fight even knowing she'd lose. Without a word, Marcus draped the scarf over her shoulders. Ivy startled and leaned back slightly, but the warmth was too comforting to refuse. "At least stay warm," he said, his voice low and even. Ivy clutched the scarf tighter. Then, as if she remembered something, she let her hands fall away. "I'm fine. I'm just waiting for the bus." Her voice shook, from the cold, but also from pride. She didn't want charity from anyone, especially not from a stranger in a suit that cost more than 6 months of her rent. Marcus glanced at the watch on his wrist. The Patek Philippe read 11:45 at night. "There aren't any more runs. Not tonight. The last one left an hour ago." Ivy opened her mouth to say something. Maybe another refusal. Maybe another lie. But the cough hit first. She doubled over, coughing as if her lungs were trying to claw their way out of her ribcage. Each cough dragged pain through her, and when she lifted her head, her cheeks were flushed with fever, her eyes dulled. At that moment, the rear door opened. Lily stepped down, her small boots trimmed in pink fur sinking into the snow. She walked toward them, stopped in front of Ivy, and said in a quiet voice that was strangely firm, "Get in the car. I have a seat." Marcus stared at his daughter, his throat closing. This was his Lily, the little girl who'd cried every night for the first 6 months. The little girl who'd refused to speak to anyone but her father for 2 years. The little girl who'd pushed away every nanny, every teacher, even her grandmother. And now she was inviting a complete stranger into the car. Ivy looked down at the child. In those wide brown eyes, she saw something that made her heart ache. Not a child's curiosity, not carefree innocence, but loneliness, loss, the look she'd seen in the mirror every day since her parents died. The look of a child who'd lost something that could never be replaced, and was trying to keep living without knowing how. Ivy couldn't say no. Not to those eyes. Not to that child. She rose, her legs trembling, and nodded. Ivy climbed into the car, and the warmth hit her at once like a slap. Her skin burned and stung, as if thousands of needles were piercing every cell that had been frozen for hours. She had to bite her lip so she wouldn't moan from the pain. This was the pain of coming back to life, of blood beginning to move again through veins that had nearly stopped. The door shut behind her, sealing her off from the snowstorm outside, and Ivy suddenly realized she was in an entirely different world. The faint scent of expensive leather drifted through the air, the kind of soft, supple leather she'd only ever seen through the glass of luxury shops she'd never dared step into. There was a trace of men's cologne, not heavy but refined, calling up images of high society parties and million-dollar negotiations. The black leather seat held her like an embrace, and Ivy felt out of place, like a stain on a sheet of pure white silk. She sat beside Lily, trying to fold herself as small as possible, not wanting her dirty gray uniform and her frayed, torn coat to brush against anything. But Lily didn't notice any of that. The child looked at Ivy with wide brown eyes. No fear, no hesitation, only a pure curiosity, as if she'd just found an unexpected gift. That look made Ivy think of the way children stare into a fish tank for the first time, full of wonder and delight. Lily tilted her head, and her gaze settled on Ivy's hands. Hands flushed red and swollen from the cold, fingers stiff as kindling. Without a word, Lily reached up, unfastened the butterfly hair clip that was holding back a curl of her brown hair. The clip was tiny, made of pink plastic dusted with glitter, the sort of thing any discount store sold. But the way Lily held it, cradling it like treasure, said it meant far more than that. She placed it in Ivy's palm, her small, warm fingers touching Ivy's ice-cold skin. "Mom gave me this," Lily whispered, her voice as light as breath. "But you need it more than I do right now. It's magic. It scares the monsters away." Ivy went still. She looked down at the hair clip in her hand, then up at the child smiling at her, and she couldn't understand. Why? Why did this little girl trust a complete stranger so completely? Why would she give away a gift from the mother she'd lost to a homeless woman she'd never met? Ivy wanted to give it back, wanted to say she couldn't take it, but her throat tightened and no words could get out. In the front seat, Marcus watched everything through the rearview mirror. His jaw clenched, and Dante could see the muscles in his boss's face tighten. The two men met each other's eyes in the mirror, a silent conversation that needed no words. They both knew this wasn't normal. Lily hadn't spoken to anyone since Celeste died. 2 years of silence. Nannies from the most prestigious agencies had come and gone, and no one had been able to break the wall the child had built. Even the most devoted teachers had given up after a few months. Even Victoria, the girl's own grandmother, had received nothing but empty looks and a cold, unyielding silence. And now, a strange woman, soaked through, trembling, sick, had made Lily open her heart in only minutes. The car began to move, gliding smoothly along the snow-covered road. Marcus turned to look at Ivy in the mirror. "What's your address?" A simple question. The answer should have been simple too, but Ivy stayed silent. She stared down at her torn shoes. Shoes whose soles had worn so thin she could feel every pebble underfoot, and she said nothing. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because she didn't have one. She had no address, no home, nowhere to go back to. The tiny rented room she'd once had was taken back by the landlord a week ago when she couldn't pay. Her belongings, whatever was left of them, were in the cloth bag she'd forgotten at Frank's restaurant. And now she didn't even have a job to return to so she could go back for it. Marcus watched her in the mirror, and in that cold, sharp gaze Ivy saw understanding. He didn't need her to say it. He already knew. "I was going to take you to a hotel," Marcus said, his voice low and even. "But something tells me that's not what you need." Ivy lifted her hand without thinking and touched the cashmere scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Her fingers glided over the fabric, and she had to hold back a sigh. Soft. Softer than anything she'd ever touched in her life. Not the cheap polyester she bought at thrift stores. Not the rough cotton of the uniforms she wore through long workdays. This was something entirely different. Something she'd only ever seen on women stepping out of luxury cars. Women who lived in a parallel universe from hers. And then she caught the scent. Lavender. Light. Faint. As if it had seeped into every thread a long time ago. Not the bargain perfume sold at the supermarket. This was something refined. Expensive. The kind of fragrance you had to order from little shops in Paris, or from brands she didn't even know by name. The scent of another woman. Lily leaned closer to Ivy, and her whisper sounded like she was sharing a sacred secret. "That's Mom's favorite. She wore it every winter." Ivy's heart missed a beat. She looked down at the scarf, and suddenly it wasn't just a piece of cloth anymore. It was a keepsake. A keepsake from someone who's gone. Something the man in the front seat had held on to for 2 years, and he'd draped it over her shoulders. A homeless woman he'd met less than 10 minutes ago. Ivy hurriedly raised her hands to take the scarf off. She didn't deserve it. She couldn't accept this. This belonged to his wife, to this child's mother, and she was only a stranger getting a ride in their car. But Marcus had seen her movement in the rearview mirror. He lifted a hand, a gesture that was gentle but final. "Keep it. She'd want someone to use it. It's been sitting in a closet for 2 years, covered in dust. That's not what she'd want." His voice stayed even, as if he were talking about the weather or the price of gas. But Ivy heard the crack buried deep underneath. She didn't ask anything else. But Marcus kept going, as if he needed to say it. Needed someone to listen even if that someone was a stranger. A heart condition. Congenital. But she hid it well. Or maybe she didn't know it was that serious. He paused, and Ivy saw his shoulders tighten beneath the expensive coat. One moment she was still smiling. The next moment, she was gone. In the middle of the night. Not a word of goodbye, not a single chance to say what needed to be said. The air in the car suddenly felt heavy as lead. 3 strangers, each carrying an unhealed wound, sitting in this small space and feeling each other's pain without needing words. Ivy understood that feeling. She understood what it meant to lose someone without getting to say goodbye. Her parents had gone the same way. A car accident, a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning, and her world collapsed. Lily suddenly rested her head on Ivy's shoulder, as naturally as if they'd known each other their whole lives. The child's small, warm body pressed against Ivy's arm, and Ivy went rigid, not knowing how to react. She wasn't used to closeness. She hadn't been hugged, hadn't been touched with gentleness like this in a very, very long time. "You smell nice," Lily murmured sleepily. "Not like hospitals. Mom smelled like hospitals before she went to sleep forever." Marcus turned his face toward the window, and Ivy saw his jaw clench so hard the muscle stood out beneath his skin. His throat worked as he swallowed, trying to hold down something rising inside him. Ivy couldn't see his eyes, but she knew. She knew because she'd been there too, turning her face away so no one would see her cry, swallowing tears until her throat burned. The car kept gliding forward in silence, and Ivy didn't know how long they'd been driving. She was so tired, so feverish, and the warmth of the car was lulling her into a half-awake, half-dreaming haze. Lily had fallen asleep on her shoulder, breathing evenly, softly. Then the car stopped. Ivy opened her eyes and looked out the window, and she had to blink several times to make sure she wasn't seeing things. In front of her was a mansion. No, not a mansion. It was a castle. Glass and stone, modern architecture threaded with old-world grandeur, rising out of the white curtain of snow like a dream. Light from inside spilled warm gold through enormous windows, and the whole building seemed to glow in the frozen night. "Is this your home?" Ivy asked, her voice catching. Marcus didn't answer. He only opened the door and stepped out, snow collecting on the shoulders of his black coat. Then he turned back and looked at her with eyes she couldn't read. "Welcome to my world." Ivy stepped through the front door and instantly felt as if she'd walked into a museum. The enormous estate opened up before her. Modern architecture with sharp lines, glass and stone blended so perfectly, it looked like it had been lifted straight from the cover of an expensive interior design magazine. The ceiling soared overhead, crystal chandeliers spilling soft golden light onto glossy marble floors. A spiral staircase curved up to the second level, like a sculpture. Everything was flawless. Everything was expensive. And everything was so cold it made her uneasy. Ivy looked around, searching for signs of life, of a family. But there was nothing. No family photos on the walls, only costly abstract paintings she couldn't make sense of. No toys scattered across the floor the way they were in ordinary homes with children. No laughter echoing through the vast rooms, only a heavy silence draped over everything, and shadows lurking in the corners where the light didn't reach. This house felt like a beautiful body with no soul. "It's so quiet here," Ivy said softly, and her voice echoed in the cavernous living room as if she were standing in an empty church. Marcus stood beside her, his gaze sweeping the room with something Ivy couldn't name. Maybe grief, maybe emptiness, maybe both. "It's been like this since she died," he answered, not looking at her. Lily, seemingly untouched by the weight in the air, suddenly grabbed Ivy's hand and tugged her toward the staircase. "I'll show you my room. I have toys." Her voice rang out bright with excitement, and it might have been the liveliest sound this house had heard in a very long time. Ivy let Lily pull her along, but as they passed the living room, her eyes snagged on the large television that was on. The volume turned down so low it was almost inaudible. Almost. She still heard it. "The Blackwood Empire continues to dominate Chicago's underground economy. Authorities still can't." Marcus moved so fast Ivy barely saw him. A second later, the screen went dark. Nothing but black. Ivy looked at him, questions flooding her eyes. The Blackwood Empire, the underground economy, the words spun in her mind, trying to fit themselves into a picture that made sense, but Marcus didn't explain. He just stood there, his face unreadable, as if nothing had happened. "Lily, take Ivy up to your room," he said evenly. "I'll be up in a bit." Lily squealed and kept pulling Ivy up the stairs. Ivy glanced back once more before she disappeared around the curve, and she saw Marcus standing at the foot of the staircase, watching them. His eyes followed his daughter with something Ivy recognized as hope, fragile hope, like a candle in the wind, afraid of going out at any moment. Dante stepped up beside Marcus, his voice so low it was nearly a whisper. "Who is she, boss?" Marcus didn't take his eyes off the staircase, where Lily's laughter still echoed. "I don't know yet, but Lily's laughing. That's enough." After Lily showed off her bedroom stuffed with plush animals, a butler appeared and led Ivy to a guest room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The room was much smaller than she'd imagined after seeing the scale of the house, but it was warm. An electric fireplace glowed gently in the corner, casting a comforting amber light. A single bed had been made up with crisp white linens, and on a small table by the window, a mug of hot cocoa steamed, its sweet scent spreading through the air. Beside the cocoa was a small note. Ivy picked it up, and she recognized the firm handwriting, slanted slightly to the right. "Thank you for staying, even if it's only for one night." Ivy sat in the chair by the fireplace, both hands wrapped around the mug of cocoa, feeling warmth seep into palms that still ached from the cold. She looked down at the note, then around the small room, then out the window where snow was still falling into the dark. And then she cried. Not the sobbing cry of misery, not the desperate crying of nights curled up in a freezing rented room, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. These were quiet tears, sliding down her cheeks without her being able to stop them. For the first time in months, in years, someone had seen her, not looked through her as if she were a ghost, not looked down on her with contempt the way Frank Castellano had, but truly seen her. A stranger had stopped his car in the middle of a snowstorm for her. He'd draped his late wife's scarf over her shoulders. He'd opened the doors of his home to her, and he'd left a note thanking her for staying. But even as the tears fell, Ivy's mind wouldn't stop turning. The Blackwood Empire, the underground economy, men in black suits guarding everywhere. The gun she'd glimpsed beneath the seat, Marcus's cold, sharp eyes, familiar with darkness. Who was Marcus Blackwood? And what kind of world had she just stepped into? A scream of crying tore through the quiet night. Ivy jolted upright in bed before her mind even had time to process what was happening. The instincts of someone who'd once been a nurse were sunk deep into her blood, and they didn't need permission from reason to move. She burst out of the room, bare feet slapping against the icy wood floor, and ran down the hallway toward the sound. Lily's room. She shoved the door open, and what she saw made her chest tighten. The little girl sat curled up on the bed, her back pressed to the headboard, her brown eyes wide open but seeing nothing at all. Lily was still trapped in a nightmare, caught between dream and waking, and she was crying for someone who'd never come again. "Mom, Mom, don't go. Mom, don't go." This wasn't the crying of a child throwing a tantrum. It was the sound of loss, of pain too large for a soul so small. Ivy stepped closer, but at that moment, Marcus appeared in the doorway. He'd been running, breathing hard, black hair tousled, the face that was usually cold now stripped bare with alarm. He rushed to his daughter's bed, wanting to pull her into his arms, wanting to soothe the pain he'd had to witness too many times over the past 2 years. But Lily shoved him away. "No, you're not Mom. You're not Mom," she screamed, her tiny hands pushing against Marcus's chest, as if he were the enemy. Marcus staggered back, and Ivy saw the pain on his face as clearly as an open wound. This was a man who could make all of Chicago tremble, a man who, from what she'd heard on the television, ruled the underground. But right now, he was only a helpless father, unable to reach his own child, unable to ease the hurt of the person he loved most in the world. Ivy didn't think. She moved on instinct. She didn't try to hug Lily, didn't try to touch her, didn't try to offer hollow comfort. Instead, she sat down beside the bed, keeping a safe distance, and began to sing. A lullaby her mother used to sing to her every night when she was small, about the stars in the sky, about gentle dreams, about the peace of the dark. Her voice wasn't pretty, and it trembled from exhaustion and from the fever that still hadn't fully broken. But she sang, softly and steadily, like a stream flowing over smooth stones. Lily kept crying, but the sobs began to ease. Those wide brown eyes, still glossy with tears, started to focus on Ivy. Her breathing slowed, from choking hiccups to shaky breaths, then gradually into something more even. The nightmare was loosening its grip. Little by little, Ivy kept singing, not stopping, until Lily was fully awake. The child looked at her, eyes still wet, lips still trembling, and then her small hand reached out and grabbed Ivy's hand like a lifeline in rough water. "Don't go," Lily whispered, her voice raw from crying. "Please, stay until the monsters are all gone." Ivy squeezed her hand gently, those tiny warm fingers resting in her palm. "I'll stay, I promise." Marcus stood beside the bed, watching in silence. Since Celeste died, no one had been able to calm Lily when the nightmares came. No one. He'd hired the best nannies, the most expensive child psychologists. They'd all failed. He'd tried himself, night after night sitting by his daughter's bed, enduring the shoves, the screaming, the refusals, and he'd failed too. But this woman he'd met less than half a day ago, had done what no one else could. Lily drifted back to sleep, her hand still holding Ivy's. Her face was peaceful, her breathing steady, and for the first time in 2 years, she looked like a normal child asleep, not a child fighting the ghosts of the past. Ivy gently slipped her hand free, pulled the blanket back up over Lily, and stood. She and Marcus stepped into the hallway, closed the door, and stood in the darkness. "How did you do that?" Marcus asked, his voice rough. Ivy looked down at her bare feet, her toes already starting to go numb on the wood floor. "I didn't do anything special. I just stayed. Sometimes that's all someone needs." Marcus looked at her, and this time he looked a little longer than he had to. The cold, shadow-used gaze she'd seen all night softened. Not completely, just enough for her to feel the difference. "Thank you," he said. Just 2 words. But the way he said them, low and sincere, carried far more than that. Then his hand lifted and gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, the strand that had fallen free when she'd run out too fast. His fingers grazed her cheek, only for a moment, but it was enough to make them both freeze. Marcus stopped, as if he'd realized what he'd done. Ivy couldn't breathe, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid he'd hear it. They stood there in the hallway darkness, only a step apart, and the air between them suddenly felt thick. Marcus was the first to break the moment. He took 1 step back, and the safe distance returned. "Get some rest. You're still not well." Ivy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She turned and walked toward her room, but she could feel his gaze following her, and she knew, without looking back, that something had shifted. Between them, in this house, in this night. Morning sunlight slipped through the curtains and woke Ivy the next day. She lay still for a moment, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, and the events of last night rushed back like a flood. The ice-cold stone bench, the black SUV, the little girl with eyes too old for her face, the man with the blade, sharp gaze, the Blackwood Empire, the underground economy, the nightmare in the middle of the night, the small hand gripping hers. And that moment in the dark hallway, when his fingers touched her cheek, Ivy sat up fast, shaking her head as if she could chase away that last thought. She didn't belong here. She didn't know anything about this man, except that he clearly wasn't ordinary. The pieces she'd gathered so far were forming a frightening picture, and she didn't want to stay long enough to see the whole thing. She had to leave, right now. Before everything got more complicated, Ivy pulled on the gray uniform that had dried overnight, then neatly folded the cashmere scarf and left it on the bed. She couldn't take a keepsake from the dead with her. She had no right. She grabbed her small bag, the only thing she had left in the world, and stepped out of the room. The spiral staircase led down to the first floor, and Ivy tried to move as quietly as she could, not wanting to wake anyone. But when she reached the last step, she froze. Lily was standing there, right in the middle of the living room, as if she'd been waiting for a long time. Her wide brown eyes were red-rimmed, her lids swollen, and Ivy realized she'd been crying. She didn't know since when, or for how long, but she had been crying. "You're leaving?" Lily's voice trembled, and the question pierced Ivy's chest like a knife. "But you promised you'd stay." Ivy set her bag down and crouched until she was level with the child's eyes. She tried to keep her voice gentle, even as her heart was breaking. "Sweetheart, I only said one night. One night is over," Lily cut in. A child's logic, simple and merciless. "It's morning now. You can stay one more day, can't you? Just one day." Ivy didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth, but no words came. And right then, a low voice sounded behind her. "Stay." Ivy rose and turned. Marcus stepped out of his study, still in the black suit he'd worn last night, as if he hadn't slept. Maybe he really hadn't. Maybe he'd been awake all night, thinking about something, and now he was looking at her with eyes she couldn't read. "Stay," he repeated. "Not as a guest, as Lily's caregiver." Ivy blinked. "What?" "I'm offering you a job. 10 times what you made at that restaurant. Free housing in this house. Full health insurance. Everything handled." Marcus listed it the way a businessman would recite the terms of a contract, but his eyes never left hers. Ivy shook her head, trying to pull her reason back through the storm of information. "Why me? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. I could be a con artist, a thief, anything. I know you don't have anywhere to go." Marcus stepped closer by one pace, his voice still even, but every word precise as a bullet. "I know you're sick and too proud to admit it. I know Frank Castellano threw you out like trash, and I know my daughter laughed for the first time in 2 years because of you. That's enough." Ivy felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know about Frank?" Marcus didn't answer directly. He only shrugged, a small gesture loaded with meaning. "I know a lot of things about this city." A tense silence settled over them. Ivy looked at him, and she decided to ask the question she'd wanted to ask since last night. "What do you do for a living, Mr. Blackwood?" Marcus met her gaze head-on, not flinching, not blinking. "Things that, if I told you right now, you'd run immediately." He paused, and his voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "But I've never hurt an innocent person, and I never will." Ivy stood there at the crossroads of her life. On one side was a frightening truth she didn't fully know. On the other was a child looking at her with hopeful eyes. Eyes that had cried because she was afraid Ivy would leave. Ivy thought of the ice-cold stone bench last night, thought of nights sleeping in parks, at bus stations, in dark corners of the city, thought of the future outside that door, with nothing waiting for her but emptiness. "1 week," Ivy said at last, and her voice sounded strange even to her. "I'll stay 1 week, then we'll figure it out." Lily squealed, a sound of pure joy, and threw her arms around Ivy. Small arms wrapped around her waist, a little face pressed into her stomach, and Ivy felt warm tears soaking through the thin fabric. Tears of happiness. She laid a hand on Lily's head, gently smoothing the child's hair, then lifted her eyes to Marcus. He was watching them, and for one brief moment, she saw something soften in the eyes that were usually so cold. Then it was gone, as quickly as it had appeared. Ivy knew she'd just signed a deal with the devil, but looking down at the child clinging to her, she couldn't regret it. 2 weeks passed faster than Ivy expected. She began to grow used to life in the Blackwood estate, to the vast rooms, to the heavy silence, and to the strange things she noticed little by little each day. Men in black suits were everywhere, stationed at the gate, posted in the hallways, patrolling the grounds. They tried to look discreet, but Ivy still saw the outlines of guns under their jackets when they moved. She pretended she didn't see, the same way she pretended she didn't hear the calls Marcus took in the middle of the night. His voice, cold as ice, carrying through the thin walls. "Handle it. I don't care how." Dante, the driver she'd met that first night, followed Marcus like a shadow. Whenever Marcus was home, Dante was nearby, sharp eyes sweeping every corner of every room as if he were hunting an invisible threat. And there were rooms in the house Ivy wasn't allowed to enter. The doors were always locked, cameras mounted on every corner, and no one ever explained why. She didn't ask. She didn't want to know the answer. But then one night, she did know. Ivy couldn't sleep. Thirst dragged her out of bed and down to the kitchen for water. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of night lights marking the way. She passed the hallway leading to Marcus's study, and she heard voices. The door was cracked open by a narrow sliver, warm yellow light spilling out. Ivy knew she shouldn't look. She knew she should turn around, go back to her room, pretend nothing was happening. But her feet didn't listen. She moved closer, and through that thin opening, she saw everything. A man was kneeling on the floor, his face bruised, his lips swollen, his whole body trembling like a leaf in the wind. Marcus stood over him, tall and terrifying, his voice as cold as ice. "You stole from me. No one steals from me and walks away like nothing happened." Dante stood nearby with a gun in his hand, the barrel pointed at the floor, but ready to lift at any second. The man on the ground cried and begged, but Marcus didn't soften. "You have 24 hours to pay back every cent. If I see your face after that and you don't have my money." Marcus bent down, grabbed the man's chin, forced him to look straight into his eyes. "You won't have a face left for anyone to look at." Ivy backed away, her heart pounding like a drum. She almost tripped, but she caught herself, spun, and ran back to her room as fast as she could. That night she didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, while the image of Marcus standing over that begging man replayed again and again in her mind. This was who Marcus Blackwood really was. The boss, the man who ruled the underground, and she was living under his roof. But life kept moving, and strangely, the house began to change. Ivy cooked every day, and the scent of food drifted through rooms that had once felt frozen. The housekeeper told her it was the first time in 2 years the house had smelled like home cooking. Lily laughed more, spoke more, started pulling dusty toys out to play with instead of leaving them untouched in the corners. And Marcus, the man she'd watched threaten to kill someone, began coming home earlier to eat dinner with them. He sat at the head of the table, watching his daughter giggle, watching Ivy ladle soup for Lily, and sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Then another night, Ivy woke to a sound downstairs. She went down the stairs, and she saw Marcus standing in the hallway, his white shirt smeared with blood. He froze when he saw her, and for a moment they only stared at each other. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice tired. Ivy didn't ask. She didn't run. She went into the kitchen, took a damp cloth, and came back to where he stood. She began wiping the blood from his hands, from his arms, silent and careful. Marcus stood still and let her, and neither of them said a word. When she finished, she looked up, and he was watching her with a wary kind of disbelief. "Aren't you afraid?" "I'm terrified," Ivy answered honestly. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. "But Lily needs me. Leaving and abandoning her is scarier than staying." A month passed, and Ivy had grown used to the double life inside the Blackwood estate. By day, she was Lily's caregiver, cooking good meals, teaching the little girl to paint and to plant flowers in the garden. She brought life back into a house that had once gone quiet as a grave, turning cold rooms into places filled with laughter and the scent of food. By night, she pretended she didn't hear the mysterious phone calls, didn't see the unfamiliar men who came and went, didn't know anything about the closed-door meetings in Marcus's study. She built an invisible wall between those two worlds, and she tried to live in the world that had Lily in it, letting the other world exist alongside it. But that wall couldn't stand forever. One afternoon, Ivy passed Marcus's study on her way upstairs to call Lily down for an afternoon snack. The door wasn't fully shut the way it usually was, and the voices inside carried out clearly. Several men's voices, tense, arguing. She knew she should keep walking, shouldn't stop, shouldn't listen. But her feet felt nailed to the floor when she heard those words. "The shipment will arrive on Friday. We need to make sure the port is under control. The southern territory is being threatened. The Castellanos are pushing in. We have to eliminate this problem before it spreads." Castellano. The name rang in Ivy's head like an alarm bell. Frank Castellano, the man who'd thrown her out into the street during a snowstorm. And now she was hearing his name in a meeting about shipments, territory, and eliminating problems. Marcus's voice cut through the noise, cold and commanding. The Blackwood family has controlled half of Chicago for 3 generations. I don't intend to lose anything to the Castellanos. Handle them, by any means necessary. Ivy backed up and bumped into a small table in the hallway. A vase wobbled, nearly tipping, and the sound rang out into the sudden silence from inside the study. The meeting stopped cold. Ivy stood there, her heart hammering as if it might burst, unable to move, unable to breathe. The door opened, and Marcus was there, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp as knives. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and they both knew everything had changed. "How much did you hear?" Marcus asked, his voice flat. "Enough," Ivy answered, her voice shaking. "Enough to understand. Enough to know. Enough to be afraid." Marcus turned back to the men inside and said one short sentence. "Clear out. We'll continue later." They filed out, one by one, eyeing Ivy with measuring looks as they passed. Dante was the last. He paused beside Marcus and murmured something under his breath. Marcus shook his head, and Dante left. Then it was only the two of them in the quiet hallway. Ivy took a step back, survival instinct screaming in her skull. "I have to go. Right now." "You can go," Marcus said, not trying to stop her. "I won't keep you here, but at least let me explain. You deserve to know." "Know what? That you're a mafia boss? That you kill people? That I've been living under the roof of a criminal for a month?" Ivy's voice rose, hysteria beginning to creep in. Marcus didn't deny it. He only stood there, looking at her with tired eyes, and began to speak. "I didn't choose this life." His voice was low, distant, as if he were talking about someone else. "My father was the boss before me. When I was 19, he was killed. An assassination right in front of my eyes. And the people who killed him didn't stop there. They wanted to wipe out the whole family. My mother, my sister, all of them." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I had 2 choices. Run and watch my family get killed one by one, or take over and protect them. I chose the second. I didn't have a choice." Ivy stood there listening, and she hated herself because part of her understood, part of her felt it. "Celeste," Marcus went on, his voice softening when he said his wife's name. "She was the only one who ever made me want out. She saw the man inside me, not the monster the world sees. I had a plan. I had everything arranged to leave this life. And then she died, before I could do anything." A heavy silence settled between them. Marcus looked at Ivy, and for the first time she saw the fragility hidden under the armor. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm only asking you not to abandon Lily. She's innocent in all of this. She needs you." Ivy held her bag and stood between the front door and the hallway leading upstairs. She looked toward Lily's bedroom at the end of the hall, where the door was slightly open and a nightlight spilled a gentle glow. Inside, she knew Lily was sleeping, hugging her teddy bear, unaware of the storm about to crash into her life. That night, Ivy couldn't sleep. She sat in the chair by the window, staring into the pitch black outside, and weighed everything. Inside her head, an endless war raged between reason and heart. On one side was safety, morality, common sense. She should run. She should leave this house immediately, before she was pulled any deeper into the frightening underworld she'd just glimpsed. Marcus Blackwood was a mafia boss. He controlled half of Chicago. He threatened to kill people as if it were ordinary conversation. She didn't belong in that world. She shouldn't be here. But on the other side was Lily. The house that was slowly coming back to life. The laughter that had returned after 2 years of silence. The nights she sang the child to sleep. The mornings they made pastries together. The way small fingers gripped her hand whenever fear rose up. And there was Marcus, too. The man with the blade, sharp eyes that softened every time he looked at his daughter. The man who'd stopped his car in the middle of a snowstorm for a stranger. The man who'd spoken of Celeste in a voice full of pain. Ivy sat there until dawn began to pale the window, and then she stood, gathered the few things she owned, and carried her suitcase down the stairs. She'd decided. She had to go. For her own safety. For morality. For every reasonable argument she'd listed to herself all night long. But when she reached the last step, she froze. Lily was standing there, right in the middle of the living room, blocking the way to the door. The child wore rabbit pajamas and clutched a teddy bear so tightly her small fingers had gone white. Her brown eyes were red and swollen, and tears were still sliding down her cheeks. "You're leaving." Not a question, a statement. Lily's voice shook, but it was certain. Just like Mom. Ivy started, but the child didn't let her finish. Mom said she'd come back too. Mom said she was only going to rest for a little while. Lily's voice cracked, and she began to sob. She didn't come back. Never. Ivy set the suitcase down and crouched until she was level with the child's eyes. Her heart hurt like someone was crushing it in their fist. "I'm not your mom, sweetheart." "I know," Lily hiccuped, tears spilling in streams down her cheeks. "But you're like her. When you sing, when you hold my hand, when you make pancakes, it feels like I have Mom. Please don't go. Please." Ivy looked up and saw Marcus on the staircase. He didn't speak, didn't interfere, didn't try to persuade her to stay. His face was stone, expressionless, but his eyes were desperate. He'd accepted that he'd lose her. He'd prepared himself for this moment, and he wouldn't stop her if she wanted to leave. Ivy looked down at the child crying in front of her, and every memory of the past month came rushing back. The nights she'd soothed Lily through nightmares, the sunny breakfasts in a kitchen full of light, the child's laughter echoing through a house that had once been dead quiet, the way Lily held her hand when she was afraid, as if Ivy were the only lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. And Ivy understood she couldn't go. Not because of Marcus, not because of this house, but because of the child standing in front of her, a child who'd already lost her mother and was terrified of losing one more person. Ivy lowered her suitcase to the floor. "I'm not going anywhere." Lily stood there for a second, as if she couldn't believe she'd heard correctly. Then she threw herself into Ivy's arms, sobbing into her shoulder. Small arms wrapped tight around Ivy's neck, and Ivy held her back, one hand smoothing her hair, one hand patting her back. Ivy heard a long exhale from the staircase, and when she looked up, she saw Marcus breathe out as if he'd just been spared. His shoulders sagged, and for one brief moment, the armor fell away, leaving only a man who was exhausted and grateful. "But we need rules, Marcus." Ivy rose, still holding Lily in her arms. "If I'm staying, I need to know I'm safe. Lily needs to be safe. No one brings violence into this house when she's here." Marcus nodded, his gaze serious. "You have my word. No one touches you. No one touches her. Never." He came down the staircase, step by slow step, until he was standing in front of Ivy. They were close enough that she could smell his familiar cologne, close enough to feel the heat coming off his body. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "For staying. For her. For—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, his hand lifted, gently tipped her chin up, and his thumb wiped away tears she hadn't even realized were on her cheek. "For everything," he finished, his voice rough. They stood there, close enough that Ivy could count his eyelashes, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. And then Lily wedged herself between them, small arms trying to hug both of them at once. "Group hug," she cried, her voice still thick with tears but threaded with laughter. The moment broke, and Marcus stepped back, but not before Ivy caught the way he looked at her. That look said everything he hadn't put into words. This wasn't only about Lily anymore. 3 months passed like a gentle dream. The Blackwood house had changed completely, no longer the cold museum Ivy had stepped into on that long-ago night of snow and wind. Now there were fresh flowers on the dining table, roses and daisies Ivy bought every week at the neighborhood market. There were Lily's drawings hung all over the walls, bright scribbles full of color, of the house, of her father, of Ivy, of the cat she wished she could have. There was laughter at dinner, every night, when the 3 of them sat around the table and Lily chattered about school. Ivy and Marcus had slipped into a family rhythm neither of them named out loud. He came home earlier each day. She waited for him before setting dinner on the table. They read to Lily before bed, then sat with tea in the living room and talked about everything and nothing. Accidental brushes of hands happened more often. Looks lingered longer than they needed to. No one said anything, but they both knew something was growing between them. And then the storm arrived. One afternoon, while Ivy was helping Lily with homework in the living room, the sound of an engine rolled up outside. Ivy looked out and saw a glossy black Rolls-Royce stop at the gate. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was around 60, but age did nothing to soften the authority in each step. Haute couture, platinum hair curled so perfectly not a strand was out of place, and eyes sharp enough to cut through air. She walked into the house as if she still owned it, needing no one to open the door, no one to invite her. Her gaze swept the living room, stopped on Ivy, and the contempt on her face was openly displayed. "So this is the woman I've been hearing about." Her voice was ice, each word enunciated with clean, sharp precision. "The one living in my daughter-in-law's house, wearing her clothes, sleeping under her roof." Ivy stood, protective instinct making her pull Lily behind her. She hadn't even had time to speak when Marcus appeared from his study, his steps quick and decisive. "Mother, you should have called first." There was no warmth in his voice for his own mother, only cold vigilance. Victoria Blackwood turned to her son, one eyebrow arching. "Do I need permission to visit my own granddaughter?" Then she looked back at Ivy, her gaze traveling up and down, weighing her from head to toe. "She's Lily's caregiver, I'm told." "Is that what we call it now?" The implication in her tone was as clear as daylight. Ivy was a gold digger, using a grieving child to reach Blackwood money. She could feel the hatred radiating from the woman. Hatred that didn't need a reason, only Ivy's existence. Victoria opened her crocodile leather purse and took out a thin file. "I had you investigated." She threw it onto the table, and papers fanned out, laying everything bare. "A former nurse, fired for theft, homeless, working in a filthy restaurant before my son picked you up like a stray dog. And now somehow you're living in this estate?" Ivy felt the blood drain from her face. The past she'd believed she'd buried was being dragged into the light in front of everyone. She wanted to fold in on herself, to disappear, to run from the judging eyes boring into her. And then a small voice cut through. "Grandma." Lily darted out from behind Ivy, her face lit up. "Ivy is really nice. She reads me stories and makes pancakes." Victoria looked down at her granddaughter, and for a brief moment her expression softened. But then she lifted her eyes back to Ivy, and the hatred returned, stronger than before. "You've manipulated a grieving child. Disgusting." Ivy drew a deep breath. She could bow her head, stay silent, let this woman grind her down the way so many others had. But she wasn't the trembling girl on an ice-cold stone bench anymore. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and met Victoria's eyes. "I was cleared of those accusations, Mrs. Blackwood. There was no evidence because I didn't do it. I'm innocent." Victoria gave a cold laugh, a sound with no warmth in it at all. "A thief is always a thief. People like you never change." Tension filled the room like a tightening wire. And then Marcus stepped forward and stood beside Ivy, his shoulder brushing hers in an unmistakably protective gesture. "That's enough, Mother." His voice was steel. Victoria stared at her son, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're choosing her over your own family?" Marcus didn't answer. He only stood there, solid as stone. And Ivy knew the family war had officially begun. Victoria turned to her son with an ordering look. "We need to talk in private. Right now." She didn't wait for Marcus to answer. She simply pivoted and walked toward the study as if it were still her house. Marcus flicked a glance at Ivy, his eyes trying to say something. Then he followed his mother. The door closed, but not all the way. Ivy stood in the hallway, knowing she shouldn't listen, knowing this wasn't her business. But her feet felt nailed to the floor, and the voices carried out with brutal clarity. "Get rid of her, Marcus. Tonight. The Blackwood name can't be linked to someone like her." Victoria's voice was sharp as a blade, every word in order. "Someone like what, Mother? Someone who wasn't born into silk." Marcus's voice stayed calm, but Ivy heard the danger under it. "Someone with a record. Someone with no class, no bloodline. Celeste would." "Don't." Marcus cut her off, his voice ice, and Ivy felt the air thicken even from outside the door. "Don't you dare use Celeste against me." A tight silence stretched. Then Marcus went on, his voice low, every word clear and final. "Lily's laughed more in the last 3 months than in the last 2 years combined. Ivy did that. Not the expensive psychologists you hired. Not the nannies from Switzerland. Not you. Not me. Her." Victoria drew in a sharp breath. "You're choosing a stranger over your own mother?" "I'm choosing my daughter's happiness. Something you've never understood." Marcus's voice turned bitter. "You never chose my happiness. You never chose Father's. Everything has always been about the Blackwood name." Ivy heard footsteps pacing, the click of Victoria's heels on the wood floor. "I'll cut you off. I'll pull support from every business partner. I'll make everything you've built collapse." The threat in her voice was real and unmistakable. This wasn't empty talk. Victoria Blackwood had power, connections, and she was willing to use all of it to get what she wanted. But Marcus didn't waver. "Then do it. I've built an empire once. I can build it again. Without you." Silence. Then the door flew open, and Victoria stepped out, her face flushed with rage. She saw Ivy standing in the hallway, and her look was pure contempt. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice cold as ice. "All of you will regret it." Then she stormed out, the front door slamming with a crash that echoed through the house. Ivy stood there, her heart racing, when Marcus came out of the study. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders carrying the weight of the world. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said, his voice low. You didn't have to do that. She's your mother. Family is Lily. Marcus cut her off, stepping closer. Family is this house. Family is... He stopped, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. Marcus moved closer, slow, one step at a time, as if giving her the chance to run if she wanted. But Ivy didn't run. She stood there and watched him come, her heart pounding like a war drum. His hand lifted and tipped her face up, gentle as if he were afraid she'd shatter under his rough fingers. Tell me to stop, he whispered, his warm breath spilling over her lips. Ivy didn't say a word. Instead, she rose onto her toes and kissed him first. Her lips touched his, and the world fell away. The kiss was soft and trembling, tasting of the salt of tears she hadn't realized she'd cried, and the sweetness of hope she didn't dare believe she could still feel. Marcus kissed her back, one hand sliding into her hair, the other wrapping around her waist and pulling her closer. As if he'd been waiting for this moment for 3 months. As if he'd held himself back too long and couldn't hold back anymore. When they parted, they were both breathing hard. Marcus rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, and whispered, I don't deserve you. Maybe you don't, Ivy whispered back, a small smile blooming on her mouth. But I'm still staying. From a second-floor window, Lily stood watching down into the garden where her father and Ivy stood, forehead to forehead. She didn't understand everything that was happening, but she understood one thing. Ivy wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time in a long time, Lily smiled a smile with no shadow of sadness in it. A few miles away, in a dim office on the south side of Chicago, a man sat behind an old oak desk. Only a single desk lamp burned, throwing strange shadows up the walls. Frank Castellano sat there, his face bruised with restrained fury, his fingers tapping out a steady rhythm on the tabletop. In front of him were photographs. The first showed a brown-haired woman holding a little girl's hand as they walked past a school gate, both of them smiling as they talked. The second, taken from a distance through a fence, showed that same woman kissing a man in the garden of a luxurious estate. Frank picked up the photo, studied the woman's face, and memory surged back like a flood. That night, the night of the snowstorm. The thin girl in the gray uniform, begging him for her pay. He'd laughed in her face. He'd thrown a glass bottle at her. He'd shouted for her to get out and never come back. He hadn't known. He couldn't have known that the homeless girl would end up in Marcus Blackwood's house, his #1 enemy. 10 years earlier, Frank Castellano had been a partner to the Blackwood family. They'd shared territory, controlled shipping routes together, built an empire in the dark side by side. Then Frank had gotten greedy. He'd started trafficking people, a line that even the underworld considered forbidden. And Marcus Blackwood had found out. No warning, no negotiation. Marcus had simply taken everything back. Territory, partners, supply, customers. In a single night, Frank Castellano went from a boss who stood level with Blackwood to a second-rate operator, forced to claw for whatever scraps were left just to survive. He'd lost everything: money, power, reputation, and he'd waited 10 years to take revenge. Now, staring at the photograph of Marcus kissing the woman Frank had thrown into the street, Frank smiled. A poisonous laugh rose in the dark room, cold and full of promise. The door opened, and one of his men stepped in, bowing with practiced respect. Boss, we confirmed it. She's living in the Blackwood house. Looks like they're close. Close, Frank repeated, his finger tapping the photo. So after all these years, the devil finally has a weakness. Marcus Blackwood finally has something to lose. He stood and went to the window, looking out at the city at night. A plan began to take shape in his mind, each piece dropping neatly into place. That girl was the key. She was the road straight into Marcus Blackwood's heart, and Frank would use her to destroy the man who'd taken everything from him. Frank turned back to the desk and lifted the phone. He dialed a number he'd kept saved for a long time, a number he'd never used until now. The line rang 3 times before someone answered. Mrs. Blackwood, Frank said, his voice smooth as velvet. I believe we share a common interest. I have information about the woman living with your son. Information that could help both of us get what we want. Silence on the other end. Long. Frank waited, patient as a snake watching its prey. He knew Victoria Blackwood. He knew her pride. He knew she'd never accept a homeless girl inside her family. Then Victoria's voice came through, cold and calculating. I'm listening. Frank smiled in the darkness. 2 enemies, utterly different, driven by utterly different motives, yet sharing one goal: to remove Ivy Collins. One wanted to protect the family name. One wanted to destroy that family completely, and neither of them knew they were playing with fire. A week passed, and life in the Blackwood estate went on as if nothing had happened. Ivy and Marcus kept their distance in front of Lily, careful not to confuse the child or invite questions they weren't ready to answer. But the accidental brushes of hands when passing a plate, the looks that lingered across the dinner table, the moments they stood closer than necessary in the kitchen, none of it could hide that something had shifted between them. Lily might not have understood, but she could feel it. She laughed more, sang more, and sometimes she deliberately tried to create chances for her father and Ivy to end up standing side by side. That afternoon, Ivy was sitting in the living room reading to Lily when the doorbell rang. She looked up, and her heart sank when she saw who stood outside. Victoria Blackwood, but this time she hadn't come alone. She carried a black leather briefcase, and behind her was a man in a gray suit holding an extra thick stack of files. Marcus stepped out of his study, his face hardening the instant he saw his mother. Mother, again. This time it's different, Marcus. Victoria came in, and her voice wasn't angry the way it had been before. Instead, it carried worry, almost pleading. I'm not here to argue. I'm here because I love you, because that woman is lying to you. She turned to look at Ivy, and there was no contempt in her eyes now, only a false pity. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Marcus. I'm doing it because I have to protect you, because she's deceiving you. Victoria signaled to the man in the suit, and he set the stack of files on the table and opened them page by page. Hospital paperwork stamped in red, termination of employment, reason theft, a formal complaint from hospital administration, photographs of Ivy being escorted out of the building by security, her face lowered, her hand shielding her eyes, and a signed statement from someone claiming to be a witness. The witness is willing to testify in court, Victoria said, triumph in her voice. Dr. Nathan Hayes. He was there. He saw everything. He saw her take medication from the supply room. Ivy stood there, staring at the photos, the files, the evidence of a past she'd thought she'd buried. She could have cried. She could have begged. She could have run the way she had so many times before when the past caught up to her. But she did none of those things. Instead, she asked, her voice so calm it surprised even her. That witness. You said Dr. Nathan Hayes? Victoria nodded, her mouth lifting into a victorious smile. Yes, a respected physician. Ivy smiled, but her smile was cold, with no warmth in it at all. A respected physician who just happens to be the reason I lost everything. She stepped closer to the table and held Victoria's eyes without blinking. I'll tell you the truth no one ever gave me a chance to say. She took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I was a nurse in the intensive care unit at St. Mary Hospital. One night, I discovered the opioid pain medication count in the supply room didn't match the records. I kept watch, and I found Dr. Nathan Hayes stealing the drugs to sell on the black market. Ivy's voice trembled, but she kept going. I followed procedure. I reported it to management. I thought they'd investigate, that they'd find the truth. But before the investigation was finished, Nathan Hayes framed me. He said I was the one stealing. He said he'd seen it with his own eyes. She gave a bitter laugh, a respected doctor's word against an ordinary nurse. Who do you think they believed? I never had a chance. I was fired, smeared, blacklisted. No hospital would hire me again. I lost my career, my home. I lost everything. Because I tried to do the right thing. Victoria watched her, suspicion still on her face. That's a very convenient story. Anyone can make up an excuse. Silence settled over the room. Marcus had sat through the entire exchange without speaking, his face blank. Ivy didn't know what he was thinking. Didn't know who he believed. She'd told the truth, and that was all she could do. Then Marcus stood. He didn't look at his mother, didn't look at Ivy. He only stared straight ahead and called out, Dante. The door opened, and Dante walked in as if he'd been waiting just outside. Find everything you can on Dr. Nathan Hayes. Hospital records, financial records, personal history, all of it. I want it on my desk in 48 hours. Dante nodded once and disappeared. Victoria stood there, stunned, as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. You believe her over your own mother? Over clear proof? Marcus turned to his mother, his dark eyes cold as steel. I believe in the truth, Mother. Something you should have learned to believe in a long time ago. The truth always comes out, sooner or later. 3 tense days passed like 3 years. Ivy and Marcus barely spoke, only trading the short, necessary sentences about Lily and the routines of the house. The ghost of suspicion hung between them, unspoken, but both of them felt it. Ivy understood. Even if Marcus had ordered an investigation, that didn't mean he believed her. Maybe he only wanted certainty before making a decision. Maybe he was weighing whether to send her away or keep her. She didn't know, and not knowing was killing her a little more each day. Lily felt the shift. She grew quiet, smiled less, often sitting alone in her room instead of racing through the house the way she usually did. Once she asked Ivy in a tiny voice, "Is Ivy mad at Dad? Is Dad mad at Ivy?" Ivy didn't know how to answer. She only pulled the child into her arms and promised everything would be fine, even though she didn't know if it would be. On the afternoon of the third day, Dante came back. Ivy was in the living room when she heard heavy footsteps, and then the door to Marcus's study opened and closed. Her heart thudded. This was the moment the truth would be laid bare, whatever it was. Half an hour later, Marcus stepped out. He looked at her, and Ivy couldn't read a single thing on his face. "Come in," he said. 2 words, without emotion. Ivy rose and followed him into the study. Victoria was already there, seated in a chair, her back straight as a ruler but her hands tightly laced together. A thick stack of files sat on the desk, and Dante stood nearby, his face blank as always. Marcus shut the door and moved to the desk. He picked up a packet and began to read, his voice flat, like he was delivering the news. Dr. Nathan Hayes, 43 years old, surgeon at St. Mary Hospital for 12 years. He turned to the next page. Arrested 6 months ago. Charges: large-scale illegal opioid trafficking. Police found hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash in his home, along with ledgers detailing transactions with drug rings. Silence. Victoria sat there, her face draining of color. Marcus went on, and this is the most interesting part. He picked up a printed stack of emails and tossed them onto the desk in front of his mother. Internal emails between Nathan Hayes and a colleague. In them, he admits he deliberately framed a nurse named Ivy Collins to silence her before she reported his theft from the medication supply. He stopped and looked Victoria straight in the eye. The hospital sent an official letter of apology to Ivy, but she had no home, no address to receive it. Ivy stood there as tears slid down her cheeks without her realizing. 3 years. 3 years with the stain of thief on her name. 3 years of rejection from every hospital, every clinic. 3 years living under the shadow of a crime she hadn't committed. "He ruined my life to save his," she said, her voice trembling. "I lost my career, my home, my dignity, all of it because I tried to do the right thing." Marcus pushed the stack of files toward Victoria. "Do you still think she's lying?" Victoria looked down at the pages, then up at Ivy, then down again. For the first time since Ivy had met her, the arrogance drained from Victoria's face. In its place was collapse. She'd believed her son's enemy. Frank Castellano had provided the information, had used her hatred of Ivy to get what he wanted, and she'd fallen for it. I was wrong." Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. For the first time in her life, Victoria Blackwood admitted a mistake. Marcus looked at his mother, and there was no forgiveness in his eyes. "You almost destroyed the only good thing that's happened to this family since Celeste died. I hope you can live with that." Victoria stood, not meeting anyone's gaze. She headed for the door, but stopped in front of Ivy. There was no apology. Victoria Blackwood was too proud for that, but her eyes said everything her mouth couldn't. Regret, shame, and something that looked almost like respect for the woman who'd stood upright through every storm. Ivy nodded. "I don't need an apology, Mrs. Blackwood. I only need you to stop trying to separate me from Lily." Victoria looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and walked out. The door closed behind her, and this time, she wasn't an enemy anymore. Somewhere in the city, Frank Castellano had just lost his most important piece. A peaceful week slipped by, smooth as a lake with no ripples. Too smooth, like the hush that comes right before a storm. But Ivy didn't let herself think about that. She was too happy to make room for it. Everything was better than it had ever been. Victoria had retreated, no longer appearing with accusations and that scornful stare. Ivy and Marcus were closer, their touches no longer accidental, their kisses no longer something they had to hide. And Lily, so happy she almost seemed to glow, ran through the house singing nonsense songs she made up on the spot. That afternoon, Lily came home from school the way she always did. Dante drove her, like he had every day for the past 4 months. Ivy stood in the kitchen getting her snack ready, the chocolate chip cookies Lily loved most. She checked the clock. 4 o'clock. Lily would be home in 15 minutes. 4:15. Ivy began arranging the cookies on a plate. 4:30. She looked out the window. No car, maybe traffic, she told herself. 4:45. Ivy called Dante. No answer. 5 o'clock. Marcus stepped out of his study, his face tight with tension, asking where Lily was. Ivy shook her head, her throat closing. saying she didn't know and Dante wasn't picking up. 5:15. Marcus's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and Ivy watched the blood drain from his face. He stood there, as if he had turned to stone, eyes locked on what he saw. Then he turned the phone so she could see it too. A photograph. Lily sitting on a wooden chair, her hands tied behind her back, tape over her mouth, those wide brown eyes swimming with tears and terror. Beneath the photo was a message demanding $10 million in cash, naming an old warehouse on 47th Street, ordering Marcus to come alone, warning that if he didn't, his daughter would die, and saying he had 3 hours. Ivy felt her knees buckle. She had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing. Lily, little Lily, the child who'd told Ivy she looked like her mother in dreams, the child who'd clung to Ivy's hand whenever fear crept in. Now she was out there somewhere, alone, trapped inside a nightmare with no idea when it would end. The rest came fast, like blows you couldn't brace for. Marcus's men found Dante in the car, 3 blocks from Lily's school. He'd been shot in the shoulder, unconscious but alive. 3 gunmen, appearing out of nowhere, too fast for him to react. And the man behind it all, Marcus confirmed almost immediately, was Frank Castellano. Marcus went wild. For the first time since Ivy had known him, she saw him lose control completely. He smashed the wall mirror, blood running from cuts across his hands that he didn't even seem to notice. He overturned a table, hurled a chair, his voice roaring like an animal, swearing he'd kill Frank and burn everything he had. Ivy stepped in close, cupped Marcus's face in both hands, and forced him to look at her. She told him to stop and listen, her voice steady even while her heart was breaking. Rage wasn't going to save Lily. They needed a plan. Marcus stared back at her, eyes red, breath ragged, his whole body shaking with fury and fear, telling her she didn't understand. That if anything happened to Lily, he had nothing left, that Lily was everything he had left of Celeste. Everything. Ivy said she knew, and her fingers brushed his cheek, feeling the wetness of tears he didn't seem to realize were there. That was why they were going to bring Lily home, together. Marcus shook his head, saying there was no together, that Ivy had to stay here because it was too dangerous. Ivy held his gaze and her voice didn't tremble, didn't hesitate, telling him to try to stop her. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Ivy didn't give him the space. Lily called her Mom, Marcus, maybe not out loud, but in the place that mattered most. And Ivy wasn't going to sit in this house and wait for news. Not this time. The old warehouse on 47th Street sat on the edge of an abandoned industrial zone on Chicago's south side. A hulking slab of dull gray concrete rising out of a vacant lot choked with weeds and rusting junk cars. Marcus prepared his army, 20 men, fully armed, ready to storm in and tear apart anyone who dared lay a hand on his daughter. But they couldn't storm in. Frank had Lily as a hostage, and one wrong move could cost the little girl her life. Ivy stood beside Marcus inside the black SUV parked a block away from the warehouse, studying the map on her phone as memories of her days working for Frank surged back. "I know that warehouse," she said, steadier than she felt. "I used to deliver here when I worked for Frank. There's a back entrance through the loading area. They never lock that door because it sticks." Marcus turned to her, worry in his eyes that he couldn't hide. "If anything happens to you, then at least it happens while I'm fighting for her." Ivy cut in, gripping his hand hard. "Not while I'm hiding. I can't sit here and wait, Marcus. I can't." The plan came together in a handful of minutes. Marcus would go in through the front with the money, buy time with Frank any way he could. At the same time, Ivy would slip in through the back, find Lily, and get her out. Simple in theory, deadly in reality. Ivy held on to what Marcus had taught her over the past 3 months. How to defend herself, how to move through darkness, how to stay calm when everything around her was collapsing. She'd never imagined she'd have to use those skills. At 8:45 that night, they arrived. The warehouse was black as ink, only a few weak bulbs inside casting thin yellow streaks through filthy windows. Marcus looked at Ivy one last time, and in that look were 1,000 things he wanted to say, and no time to say any of them. Then he stepped out, the suitcase of cash in his hand, and walked toward the front door. Ivy waited until he vanished inside, then she moved. She followed the back wall of the warehouse, her body pressed close to the freezing concrete, each step as light as a feather. The loading dock door was exactly where she remembered it, and just as she'd guessed, it wasn't locked. She slipped inside, and darkness swallowed her whole. Her heart hammered like a war drum, but she forced herself into stillness. Lily needed her. She didn't have the right to be afraid. She moved through empty shelving and forgotten aisles, remembering every corner from the days she delivered shipments. Left at the third set of shelves, straight through the packing area, The storage room in the back, where they used to keep leftover stock. That was where they'd hold Lily. Voices echoed from the front of the warehouse. Frank's voice, smug and poisonous. Marcus's, cold as ice but controlled. They were talking, bargaining, buying time. Ivy found the storage room. Through the crack of a partly open door, she saw Lily on a wooden chair, her hands tied, her eyes glossy with tears, and a guard standing beside her with a gun in his hand. Ivy waited. Each second stretched into an hour. Then shouting exploded from the front, the slam of a fist, curses ripping through the air. The guard turned toward the noise, distracted for just a second. 1 second was enough. Ivy surged in with a fire extinguisher in her hands and brought it down hard on his head before he could react. He hit the floor with a dull thud and went still. Ivy rushed to Lily, her hands shaking as she worked the knots loose. "Ivy," Lily sobbed, her voice thick and broken. "I knew you'd come." "Shh, sweetheart. I'm getting you out. Quiet, okay?" Ivy pulled Lily into her arms and started toward the back exit. They were almost out. Only a few more steps. Then a shadow filled the doorway. Frank Castellano stood there with a gun, a vicious smile on his mouth. Well, the stray dog thinks she's a hero." Ivy shoved Lily behind her and planted herself between the child and the weapon, her body a shield. Her heart went wild, but she didn't step back. Frank aimed the gun at her, his eyes flat with cruelty. "You should have stayed on that frozen stone bench, sweetheart. That would have been a gentler death than what I'm about to give you." "If you want to kill her," Ivy said, her voice steady, "you'll have to kill me first." Frank laughed, the sound echoing in the dark warehouse. "That can be arranged." The gunshot cracked. Ivy squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for pain. But nothing came. She opened her eyes and saw Frank crumpling. One hand clamped to his leg, blood spilling from the wound. Behind him stood Marcus, his pistol still smoking, his dark eyes burning like hell itself. Marcus stepped over Frank as he groaned on the floor, the gun still aimed at his head, his dark eyes blazing with a rage Ivy had never seen. "I should kill you," Marcus said, his voice ice cold, each word dropping like a death sentence. Slowly, painfully, for every second my daughter had to be afraid. Frank lay there, blood pouring from the wound in his leg, and still he laughed, a wild laugh, full of challenge. "Do it. Prove to everyone you really are the monster they say you are." Marcus stood with his finger on the trigger, and Ivy could see the war tearing him in two. Part of him wanted to squeeze, to end the man who dared touch his daughter, to rip him apart piece by piece. But another part, the part Celeste had loved, the part Ivy had seen in his gentle moments with Lily, was holding him back. "Dad." Lily's voice came, small and trembling. She was clinging to Ivy, her face buried in Ivy's shoulder, but she could still see. "Don't." Marcus turned, and when he saw his daughter, when he saw those wide brown eyes filled with fear looking up at him, the rage drained away. He lowered the gun. "No, prison is too kind for you." His voice stayed cold, but the killing edge was gone. "But my daughter doesn't need to watch me kill someone. She's seen enough violence for a lifetime." Marcus's team flooded into the warehouse, taking Frank and the remaining men under control. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they came closer. There would be more than enough to put Frank Castellano away for life. Kidnapping, extortion, conspiracy to murder, and countless other charges Marcus had been collecting for 10 years. When it was over, when Frank was in handcuffs and shoved into a police car, Lily broke free of Ivy's arms and ran to Marcus. She threw herself against her father, sobbing, and then she turned and reached out toward Ivy. "Dad, Mom." Silence. Time seemed to stop. Ivy stood frozen, not believing what she'd heard. What had Lily just called her? Marcus looked at Ivy, eyes wide, and Ivy knew he'd heard it too. For the first time, Lily had called her Mom, not Ivy. Mom, natural, unthinking, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. Tears slid down Ivy's cheeks, and she didn't try to stop them. She moved in, dropped to her knees, and wrapped her arms around both of them. The three of them stood there in the filthy warehouse, in the chaos and the scream of sirens, holding on as if they'd never let go. "She called you," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "I heard," Ivy whispered back, holding Lily tighter. On the drive home, Lily fell asleep in Ivy's arms, exhausted after the nightmare. She curled like a kitten, one hand gripping Ivy's shirt, her breathing steady and peaceful, as if she knew she was safe, as if she knew she was home. Marcus drove with one hand on the wheel and reached over with the other to hold Ivy's hand. They didn't speak, sitting in silence, but it was the silence of people who didn't need words to understand each other. "You almost died for her," Marcus said at last, his voice low. "I'd do it again, 100 times." Silence stretched on. Streetlights slid past, painting yellow stripes across their faces. Then Marcus spoke, sudden, like he couldn't hold the words inside for one more second. "Marry me." Ivy turned to him, stunned. "What?" "Not now, not tonight, but one day. When all of this is over, when we've healed. Marry me." Ivy looked down at Lily, sleeping in her arms, her face peaceful as an angel. Then she looked at Marcus, the man who'd saved her from a snowstorm, given her a roof, given her a family, the man she loved. "Ask me again when I'm not covered in warehouse dust," she said, a small smile lifting her mouth. "And maybe I'll say yes." Marcus smiled, the first time in that long, terrible night, and that smile lit up the darkness. A month passed, and life in the Blackwood estate slowly settled back into peace. Frank Castellano was brought to trial on a long list of charges: kidnapping, human trafficking, extortion, conspiracy to murder. 40 years without parole. When the judge read the sentence, Ivy sat in the courtroom with her hand clenched around Marcus's, and she felt a dark chapter of her life finally close. The man who'd thrown her into the street on a night of blizzard wind, the man who'd nearly killed her and Lily, would now rot behind bars until the end of his life. Dante recovered faster than anyone expected. His arm was still wrapped in bandages, but his spirit looked untouched, as if nothing had happened. One afternoon, while Ivy sat in the garden watching Lily play, Dante came over and sat beside her. "She saved Lily," he said to Marcus, who was standing nearby, but his eyes were on Ivy. "I owe her my life. Anything she needs, anytime, I'll be there." Ivy didn't know what to say. She only nodded and smiled. She'd never imagined a man like Dante would ever owe her a debt. Life was strange that way. Then Victoria came to visit. This time there was no shining Rolls Royce, no team of lawyers, no stack of accusations. Only an older woman, looking more tired than the last time Ivy had seen her, stepping into the house with a hesitation Ivy had never seen in Victoria Blackwood before. She held Lily longer than usual, eyes closed, as if she were thanking God her granddaughter was still alive. Then she turned to Ivy, and in her hand was a small dark blue velvet box. "This is for you," Victoria said, her voice no longer cold or contemptuous, only a sincerity Ivy hadn't believed this woman was capable of. Ivy opened the box and her breath caught. Inside was an exquisite silver bracelet, its lines elegant and flowing, and engraved on the inside was a small letter C. "This belonged to Celeste," Victoria said. "She wore it on her wedding day, and I believe she would want the woman who loves her family to have it." "Mrs. Blackwood, I can't," Ivy started, but Victoria cut her off. "You can, and you will." She paused, and Ivy saw something in her eyes she hadn't expected to see. "Regret. Consider this. An apology. The only way I know how to apologize." That afternoon, Marcus brought Ivy and Lily to the cemetery. The car stopped near a quiet section shaded by trees, and they walked along a stone path until they reached a grave. Simple, elegant. Fresh flowers sat in a vase, clearly replaced every week. The headstone read, "Celeste Marie Blackwood, beloved wife, devoted mother, forever in our hearts." Lily ran ahead, holding a sunflower she'd asked Marcus to buy on the way, the kind Celeste loved. She placed it beside the stone, then sat down in the grass and began talking as if her mother were sitting right there. "Hi, Mom. This is Ivy. She takes care of me now. She sings like you, but different songs. She makes pancakes, but sometimes they burn." Lily giggled. "I think you'd like her." Ivy felt tears rise. She knelt beside the grave, beside Lily, and she began to speak, her voice a whisper, like she was sharing a secret with an old friend. "I'll never replace you. I'll never try to. But I promise I'll love them, both of them, with everything I have. I promise I'll keep Lily safe. I'll make her laugh. I'll be there when she cries. And I promise I'll take care of Marcus too, even when he thinks he doesn't need it." Marcus stood behind them and heard every word. When Ivy rose and turned, she saw his eyes were wet. "She'd like you," he said, his voice thick. "She liked picking up strays too. That's how she ended up with me." Ivy leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and smiled. "Then, maybe it's a family tradition." They left the cemetery hand in hand, Lily running ahead, stopping to pick wildflowers along the path. The past was laid to rest. The future was waiting. 6 months later, on a spring afternoon in the Blackwood garden, the peach trees were in full bloom. Pale pink petals drifted on the breeze like colored snow, settling over the lush green grass. Ivy had planted them the previous autumn, when she officially became part of this home. Now they had grown, they had flowered, the way her love had. A small gathering was held outside, only family and the people closest to them. Victoria sat beneath the shade of a tree, softer than the first time Ivy had met her, smiling now and then as she watched Lily run and laugh. Dante stood near the gate, his arm fully healed, still keeping watch the way he always did. But today he was smiling too. No show, no extravagance, only the warmth of people who truly loved one another. Then Marcus walked out into the garden, where Ivy stood admiring the blossoms. He took her hand, and to everyone's surprise, he dropped to one knee. In his hand was a small box, and inside was a simple ring, warm gold, a modest diamond, not flashy, just perfect. 6 months ago you told me to ask again when you weren't covered in warehouse dust. Ivy laughed, tears already rising. I remember. You don't have dust on you anymore. So here I am, keeping my promise. Marcus held her hand tightly, his dark eyes fixed on her with all the love he had. I don't deserve you. I'm darkness, violence, sin, everything you should have run from. But you stayed, through all of it, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. You already do, Ivy whispered. Is that a yes? Lily burst in, unable to hold herself back any longer. Say yes, Ivy. Please, please, please. Ivy laughed, tears slipping down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Marcus slid the ring onto her finger, fitting as if it had been made only for her. They kissed beneath the peach blossoms, to Victoria's applause and Dante's, to Lily's thrilled cheering. 1 year later, a morning in the Blackwood kitchen. Ivy stood in front of the mirror with her hand resting on her round pregnant belly, a smile on her face that never seemed to fade. Lily ran in, small feet pattering on the floor. Mom, the baby kicked again. She pressed her ear to Ivy's belly, whispering as if sharing a secret. Hi, baby. I'm Lily. I'm your big sister. I'll teach you everything, like how to ask Dad for extra cookies. Marcus came in and wrapped his arms around both of them from behind. Did someone say cookies? Nothing. Lily grinned. Ivy leaned back against her husband's chest and looked out the window at the garden bursting with flowers. The house that had once been cold as a museum was now filled with family pictures on the walls, filled with laughter echoing through every room, filled with life in every small corner. My mother used to say, Ivy whispered, where there are flowers, there's hope. Marcus kissed her hair, his voice warm. Then we've got a lot of hope. This story reminds us that family isn't always something you're born into. Sometimes it's something you build. Through storms and silence, through loss and love, through the harshest winters and the coldest nights. Ivy's journey teaches us that dignity can survive any hardship, that healing begins when we accept our own worth, and that sometimes even the devil can find redemption if the right person shows him the road. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so we'll know. Share it with someone who needs to believe their story isn't over yet. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did you see yourself in Ivy, in Marcus, or in Lily? Real life can be as brutal as that snowstorm night, but there are always hands ready to pull us up. Leave a comment and share what you feel deep in your heart. We'd truly love to hear it. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.